Benjamin Abelow is a researcher and writer on nuclear arms policy. He is a graduate of European history as well as medicine. His recently published book is entitled How the West Brought War to Ukraine. This very readable book looks at the historical background to the current conflict in Ukraine. It explains a lot about how this war erupted. Benjamin Abelow, welcome.
Thank you, Finian.
Benjamin, in your well-researched book, you conclude that the United States and its NATO allies bear tremendous responsibility for the war in Ukraine with Russia. Can you explain why you conclude that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I think I could break this down into three steps, the last one of which I don't really touch on in great detail in the book because it's more recent. But the first step simply is that I think the West, with U.S. leadership, really brought this crisis about by expanding NATO right up to Russia's borders. And this was done in disregard of assurances that were given to Moscow at the time that the Soviet Union was collapsing. But whether or not those assurances are important in people's minds, one only needs to think about how a country like the U.S. might react if a foreign power, let's say Russia or China, established a military alliance in Canada or Mexico and started placing forces right on the U.S. border. You know, the U.S. has something called the Monroe Doctrine, which basically says no foreign power can bring military powers into even the whole Western Hemisphere, much less against the borders. So all one has to do is develop a bit of what one might call cognitive empathy or strategic empathy and try to understand how the U.S. would react, for instance, if we, so to speak, the shoe were on the other foot. So the U.S. basically created the crisis in the first place through its patterns of military movements with respect to NATO on Russia's border. Number two, the U.S., NATO in general, but again with U.S. leadership, could probably have prevented the war in December or in January of February 22. You know, people, if you say, well, Russia had a series of requirements for their sense of security. They wanted a neutral NATO. They wanted increased autonomy for the Russian enclaves in the Donbass area. And they wanted a pullback of certain NATO forces from areas that are already right on Russia's border. For instance, a cessation of rotating troops through the Baltics. And the U.S. basically, and most importantly, just refused even to discuss the possibility of renouncing NATO membership for Ukraine. It was simply not even taken seriously as a real requirement. And the standard response was, that's none of your business, Russia. It's Ukraine's decision what they want to do. Now, that sounds very nice in principle, but all one has to do is realize that when one places military forces on another country's border, it creates a threat for that country. So that in the abstract, we would want to say, sure, every country is free to do whatever they want. But when one takes a serious look at what's actually happening, one realizes that certain free actions create threats for other countries. And in fact, Ukraine probably never would have done that without any sort of U.S. encouragement. Keep in mind that Mr. Zelensky ran for the presidency and was elected in 2019 on a peace platform with over 70% of the Ukrainian population voting for him. Now, due to the pressures from the Ukrainian far right in the country, and the refusal of the U.S. or other countries, France and Germany, to provide any serious backing for Mr. Zelensky's peace process, that the whole thing fell through, and ultimately Zelensky came under the pressure of the Ukrainian far right and effectively renounced any desire for peace. So that's number two. So first we have bringing about the crisis through the expansion of NATO to Russia's borders. Second is by not preventing the war by discussing renunciation of Ukraine membership for Russia, Ukrainian membership in NATO. And then third, if we look at what happened in March and early April, Ukraine was negotiating seriously with Russia and it looked like there would be a peace plan. But then what happened is Boris Johnson showed up. Then the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Boris Johnson, showed up and in Ukraine unannounced and basically said to Mr. Zelensky, you may be ready for peace, but we, the collective West, are not. Now, this was actually reported in the journal, in the online Ukrainian publication, Ukrainska Pravda. This is not any sort of Russian Pravda. This is a Ukrainian publication, Ukrainska Pravda, basically reported that in these words. And the basic outline of that story was confirmed in the September-October issue of Foreign Affairs magazine, Foreign Affairs Journal. So it really does seem that the West prevented a peace treaty from coming into play in March and early April. So those three things, I would say, the U.S. And NATO in general bear tremendous responsibility. And the ongoing deaths and destruction that we see in Ukraine right now is largely a result of the fact that a peace negotiation was not allowed to go forward in March.
Yeah, I mean, what you lay out there is very powerful background to I think, a proper understanding of the conflict, how it arose. Yet, there would be a lot of people in the West who would deprecate yourself and call you a Russian propagandist or a useful idiot for the Kremlin. What do you say to people who would denigrate you with that view?
Yeah, I would be very direct and blunt. I would say, first of all, it's laughable that anyone would make those kind of accusations. And second, I would say it'd be laughable that anyone would believe them. I mean, does anyone seriously think that I or anyone else who is discussing these serious policy issues from a particular perspective are actually either in the employ or dupes of Russia? Does anyone who really reads my book or any one of the many other serious articles and books that have been written think that we're idiots? What we're doing is we're presenting an alternative viewpoint and an alternative perspective about a very important foreign policy issue that has tremendous effects not only on domestic U.S. population, but on all of Europe and really the whole world. And the idea that the proper response to that is to accuse people of being dupes of the Kremlin or idiots or actually in the employ of the Kremlin is sort of laughable and beneath contempt, frankly. So I think I would, put it in those terms. I mean, it's kind of a joke that anyone takes these things seriously. Now, it's perfectly appropriate. The people who make these accusations, they may have a very different viewpoint, and they're completely entitled. It's within their rights to argue that position strongly and to argue that I and many others who hold this position that I'm arguing for are wrong. That's within their right. But the idea that they, instead of arguing on the facts and on the merits of the arguments, on the facts on the ground, would accuse a group of people who really have nothing but the interest of their own country and of the countries of Europe and the world, at their core and at their heart, would be dupes is a crazy idea.
Because I mean, there's many respected U.S. diplomats and intellectuals who would totally concur with your view that there was a background to this whole conflict. We've got people like John Mearsheimer, Jack Matlock, the former U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, the late Stephen Cohen. Many scholars and diplomats would agree that just what you've said, that there was a whole background to this build-up of conflict. And tellingly, these kind of people, those that are still alive, are never heard in the Western media. They seem to be excised from the public discussion.
Well, I would say, first of all, they're not completely excised, but they're obviously they're relegated to the margins and they're seen as a minority voice. And sometimes they themselves are accused of being dupes of the Kremlin, which is, again, a crazy idea. I'll just mention, again, my book, How the West Brought War to Ukraine. So the book was actually endorsed by some of the people you mentioned. It was endorsed by John Mearsheimer of the University of Chicago. It was endorsed by Colonel Douglas Macgregor, who was an Iraq war hero and was actually the director of a very important NATO command center, a joint operations center for the Supreme Allied Headquarters in Europe. The book was endorsed also by Chaz Freeman, who was a previous Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. It was endorsed, as you said, by Jack Matlock, who was a U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, and others. So these are very strong voices, and they obviously have their own very strong positions, but they felt that my argument was enough in concord with their own that they felt they wished to offer strong endorsements. The book has also been strongly endorsed by a number of people on the left. And I would mention here Noam Chomsky, and actually I put his endorsement on the cover. He's a very serious thinker. I put him on the cover. He's the best known of my endorsers to the general public. But really, there's a whole range of very serious people who've endorsed the book and have argued for these positions. Yet, nonetheless, their views have been relegated to the margin at many points.
Yeah. Ben, you make the point in your book that false narratives lead to increasing error and tragedy. And the Western mainstream media seem to have censored a lot of your kind of view as in explaining the causes of the conflict in Ukraine. The dominant Western narrative seems inaccurate and is leading to ever more reckless policy choices by those in power in government. This week, for example, the Biden administration announced it is sending Patriot missiles to Ukraine, another escalatory step, it would seem. So is this decision to send Patriot missiles, is this another example of how false narratives or inaccurate narratives are just leading to one more error after another, compounding an escalation?
Yeah, I would say, to put it very broadly, that anything that is not working towards an immediate negotiated settlement of this war is a misconceived step. So the idea of supplying Patriot missiles in lieu of negotiation, the idea of supporting these attacks deep into Russia, the ideas of providing nothing but weapons and arms and aid to Ukraine instead of negotiation, all of that is misconceived. If you look at how this war has progressed, it started off as a very limited operation with 190,000 Russian troops. It started off with negotiations between Russia and Ukraine in March. Now, all of this was scuttled with the idea that the U.S. wanted to weaken Russia. This was stated by the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken at his side after a secret visit to Kiev in, I believe it was March. Now, the war was very limited at that point. And what has happened since then is the war has greatly escalated. Initially, there were no attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure. Initially, there was 190,000 Russian troops. Now we see a movement of Russian troops, probably close to 500,000. We see the destruction of the Ukrainian electrical grid, water systems, power, probably the sewage systems. We see the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines. We see an attack on the Kurd bridge. Where is this going to end? It gets worse and worse. Most recently, we saw that Ukraine launched missile attacks onto Russian bomber bases deep within Russia, 150 miles from Moscow. Drones attacked a bomber base that carries strategic nuclear weapons. Now, we're really seeing what almost amounts to a preemptive attack on Russian nuclear forces. Now, this is exactly what you do if you want to precipitate a nuclear war. So we see an ongoing escalation, and people who seem to think that what we're really doing is helping Ukraine have a different, they need to look seriously what's happening. We've had now probably over 100,000 Ukrainian deaths and many more wounded and maimed. And the longer the war goes, the worse this gets for Ukraine and the worse it gets for everyone. Mm-hmm. So I think that what is really needed is a rapid end to the war through negotiations and realistic negotiations. Russia is never going to leave Crimea, and that's a separate issue that I discuss in my book and I can talk about in more detail. Mm-hmm. But the idea that somehow we're going to compel Russia to leave Crimea and go back to where they were, giving up their naval base there, et cetera, it's just not going to happen. Mm-hmm. We need a realistic discussion about how to end this war. And that will involve compromise on both sides.
Yeah, it seems that the Western mainstream media are doing a huge disservice to public interest and the cause of peace, in that they're perpetuating very false notions about the conflict, how it started and how it's being prosecuted. And they're doing an absolute disservice to any sort of diplomatic resolution by perpetuating these false distortions about the conflict. Would you agree? Yeah. The Western mainstream media are part of the problem?
Yeah, they definitely are. They are propagating the narrative that initially came out of Washington, that Putin is the new Hitler, and that any attempt at negotiation is the new appeasement at Munich. The situation is utterly different. And the Western media, far from functioning as an independent source of information and providing context for people to understand what's actually happening, have basically become passive lapdogs of Washington and the European capitals. They've really become, I would call them, propaganda branches of the US and European capitals. It's really, it's almost inconceivable. I'll give you one simple example. Months ago, every day I get something from the New York Times, and they list, lead stories. And as I judged it, I looked at every story on one particular day, and every story was either factually incorrect or misrepresented important elements of the story. And I don't think that's so unusual. Everything we're getting in the Western media, almost everything, has a very strong bias towards it. It's basically adopting the Ukrainian narrative, lock, stock, and barrel, hook, line, and sinker, with no serious criticism, no attempt to really dig beneath the surface. Of course, I'm overstating when I say no attempt. One can find isolated stories and situations that actually provide very useful information. But the overall framework is basically an extremely propagandistic one.
Yeah. And Benjamin, you advocate for an urgent diplomatic solution to the Ukraine war. But do you think there is a capability in Washington for such diplomacy?
That's a very real question, a very good question, and a very real concern. I don't know what Washington is willing to do. I think it's very hard to know. Not only does one get mixed messages out of the Biden administration itself, there's multiple branches of government that are functioning. You have the State Department, you have the military, you have the executive branch, you have Biden himself, you have his advisors, which sometimes walk back what Biden says. You have the Joint Chiefs of Staff recently came out with a statement that we should have negotiations, and those seem to be repudiated by insiders within the Biden White House. Jake Sullivan and others seem to be moving in other directions. So it's very hard to know. I certainly hope that there is the desire for negotiation and that it occurs quickly. I can't say I'm optimistic.
Is there any precedent for this kind of seeming chaos in a U.S. administration in such a dangerous time of war or international conflict? I mean, what you've sketched there seems a shambolic administration. One hand doesn't know what the other's doing, and there's multiple faces are presented. It seems to be quite chaotic and just shambolic.
Yeah, there are many forces at play. In some respects, they are supporting each other, and in some respects, they are contrary to each other. And it is a kind of crazy structure that's happening right now.
Sorry, Benjamin, which kind of adds to the fears of something dangerous, catastrophic happening with such a lack of control or coherent policy or coherent, intelligent understanding of where we are.
Yeah, I have to say, when this missile came down in Poland, and Zelensky immediately said, "Oh, this is a Russian attack on Poland," he was trying to bring NATO directly into the war. Now, that was repudiated by the White House. Biden specifically repudiated it in a press statement. And in fact, not only Biden, but other members of the White House staff refused to take Zelensky's phone call. I thought that was a good sign. However, what's happened since then is you have a attack deep within Russia of two Russian bomber bases, one of them about 150 miles from Moscow, causing damage to a strategic nuclear bomber. And instead of Russia, instead of the White House or the US government saying, don't do that again, they basically said, you make your own decisions where you're attacking. And they offered, so it's very concerning. You asked whether there are any precedents for this. I would say this has been an ongoing struggle within the US government and within the military industrial complex, within different arms of government. When John F. Kennedy was in office during the Cuban Missile Crisis, this is quite a while ago, it's over 50 years ago. Not only the military, but Kennedy's entire White House staff, many of his handpicked assistants, wanted to launch a preemptive attack on Cuba. And it later came out, decades later, that Russia already had active nuclear weapons there, and that could have initiated a nuclear war. And it was only through the perseverance and the persistence and the clarity of mind of Kennedy himself that attack was not launched. Instead, he set up a blockade, and because he already had a pre-existing good relationship with Khrushchev, the negotiations were able to go forward, and a crisis was averted. Now, right now, we have a man in the White House, Biden, who has offended Putin to his face, who's been extremely provocative. We don't have any of the sort of established pipelines that are in place, at least none that are visible to us. One possibly hopeful sign is that the director of the CIA, William J. Burns, was previously the U.S. ambassador to Russia and seemed to have a good idea about Russia's red lines were. Now, so far, I don't see anything coming from him that would tend to really quell some of the craziness. But I'm, of course, hopeful that there are voices like his that will start to speak out and be more active and push more aggressively for a negotiated settlement before this gets out of control.
Yeah. Finally, Benjamin, if a diplomatic route out of conflict, out of potential conflict, can't be found, what do you fear is on the cards if diplomacy cannot prevail here?
Yeah, I can't see a good outcome, frankly. I guess what comes to my mind really are three different possible scenarios. One, that the US and Russia somehow, or NATO and Russia, somehow become, that the forces are more or less equal and this becomes a protracted conflict. Now, I don't think that's a good thing. That's a terrible thing. That'll destroy Ukraine even more than it's been destroyed. I mean, it'll wipe out more and more Ukrainian military people. Keep in mind, soldiers are nothing but civilians who are now fighting a battle. Keep in mind that Ukraine has laws in place that makes it a crime for anyone between the ages of 18 and 60 to leave the country. So we're talking about whether they're military people or civilian people. We have a great risk of ongoing devastation of Ukraine in terms of its human cost, in terms of its infrastructure. And we have a great deal of damage being done to Russia and a great deal of damage being done in terms of cost to NATO and the European countries. So that's one possible outcome, is sort of an equal set of forces that lead to a protracted destructive conflict. Another possibility is that one side begins to win strongly. If Russia begins to win very strongly, will the US and NATO really back down, or will they see that this is a humiliation and they refuse, and therefore they will enter their forces directly into the conflict? And then we'll have a direct US or NATO Russian conflict, basically a direct military conflict between two nuclear superpowers. In the other direction, if the US starts to win and or NATO and US start to win, what will Putin do then? Would he be willing to flee Ukraine, put his tail between his legs and leave the country? Will he be willing to exit Crimea? I don't think so. That's their major warm water naval base, and it has been for a long, long time. Will they be willing to suffer a geostrategic defeat like that, or will that push them to use tactical nuclear weapons? This is all, any way you cut this, it's very bad. The only decent exit I see is the out through a negotiated settlement. And again, I want to stress, this is not a matter of protecting the US at the expense of Ukraine, or protecting Russia at the expense of Ukraine, or protecting Europe at the expense of Ukraine. The interests of Ukraine and America and Europe are aligned, because anything that causes a protracted war will destroy Ukraine even more. And it's a very misguided idea that somehow we are fighting a humanitarian battle in Ukraine. What is really going on now, to a large extent, is a US and NATO-based proxy war against Russia being fought on battlefield Ukraine, with Ukrainian people being used as cannon fodder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And like, criminally, tragically, we'll probably, if we get out of this horrible situation, we'll just revert back to the diplomacy that Russia was proffering in around December, to talk about a strategic treaty of security, and all this war and destruction and suffering, death will have been really for nothing. We'll just revert back to what should have taken place, as you pointed out at the very outset of our interview, that diplomacy, that initiative in December that Russia was inviting the United States to participate in, but the US refused.
Yeah, I feel it's very much the case.
Benjamin, it's great to have such clarity, such clear thinking from yourself. How would readers, listeners keep in touch with your views to keep themselves informed of the situation?
Yeah, I think the best step is simply go to my website, which is benjaminabelow.com, www.benjamin, Benjamin, Abelow, ABELOW.com. There you can find information about my book. You can sign up for an email list I have. I actually have an email address there. You can reach me directly if you want. And there's easy ways to click through and order the book from there.
And again, the book, Benjamin, How the West Brought War to Ukraine. It's a great read. So, Benjamin Abelow, thank you very much for your insights. Thank you.
Thank you, Finian. Thank you for having me.